In the spring of 2021, a wildlife technician working for a state agency in South Dakota was checking trail cameras near the Cheyenne River when he pulled the memory card from a unit he'd placed at a river crossing 6 weeks earlier. The images he found on that card did not make immediate sense to him. He scrolled through the usual sequence of deer, wild turkey, a coyote moving through at 3:14 in the morning, and then, captured in the gray infrared light of a camera designed to document the ordinary wildlife of the northern Great Plains, an animal that should not have been there by any standard framework his training had prepared him to apply. The image was clear enough. The animal was large, heavy-set, moving with the characteristic rolling gait of a bear that weighed somewhere between 300 and 500 pounds. The hump above its shoulders was visible. The dished facial profile was visible. The long front claws that distinguish it from every other bear species in North America were visible in the cleaner frames where the animal had paused and turned slightly toward the camera. It was a grizzly bear. The nearest confirmed grizzly bear population in the lower 48 states was in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, more than 400 miles to the southwest. The nearest documented grizzly bear territory of any kind was further than most people in that region drive in a month. The technician sent the images to his supervisor. His supervisor sent them to regional wildlife managers. The images were analyzed, cross-referenced against the agency's records of known marked individuals, and eventually forwarded to researchers at universities that specialize in large carnivore ecology. Nobody had a clean explanation for what the images showed. Nobody had a record of a grizzly bear in that drainage. Nobody had a record of a grizzly bear in that county. The incident was documented, quietly filed, in a category that wildlife databases use for anomalous data points, and life moved on for the people involved. But the camera stayed up, and 3 months later, a different camera, 2 river drainages to the east, captured what appeared to be a different individual, again well outside any mapped range, again moving through terrain that grizzly bears had not occupied in any documented record, going back more than a century. This is not a story about 1 or 2 anomalous images from a single camera in a single state. This is a story about a pattern, and the pattern has been accumulating for long enough, across enough geography, documented by enough independent sources, that it has moved from anomaly into something else. Something that doesn't have a clean name yet in the scientific literature, but that the people tracking it understand to be real and significant, and without a fully satisfying explanation. Grizzly bears are showing up in places they are not supposed to be, not occasionally, not randomly, with enough consistency and geographic reach that the word pattern is not hyperbole, and the question of why that is happening, what it means, and what it portends for the landscape of large carnivore ecology in North America is the question that deserves a thorough and honest examination. Because the comfortable answer, the one that says these are just dispersing individuals doing what large carnivores occasionally do, does not hold up against the full weight of what the data shows. And the less comfortable answers are the ones that matter. Before you go further into this, if you find yourself drawn to the places where ecology and genuine mystery intersect, subscribe now. This channel goes to those places and does not flinch from what it finds there. The historical range of the grizzly bear in North America was staggering in its scope. Before European contact, before the systematic killing campaigns of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries, grizzly bears occupied a range that extended from the Pacific coast east to the western edge of the Great Plains, from the Arctic coast of Alaska and northwestern Canada south into the mountain ranges of Mexico. There were grizzly bears in what is now California, in the coastal ranges and the Central Valley, in numbers that early Spanish and American observers described as almost incomprehensible by current standards. There were grizzly bears in the Black Hills of the Dakotas. There were grizzly bears in the mountains of what is now Texas, and deep into Chihuahua and Sonora. The species was, before the systematic compression of its range, one of the most ecologically dominant large mammals on the continent. Population estimates for pre-contact North America range widely, but the figures most commonly cited by historical ecologists fall somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 animals in what is now the lower 48 states alone, with additional populations of comparable or larger size across Canada and Alaska. What happened to that population over the next 3 centuries is not complicated and does not require extensive elaboration here. Bounty programs, market hunting, livestock protection killing, and the large-scale conversion of habitat eliminated grizzly bears from the vast majority of their historical range with a speed and thoroughness that is, in retrospect, ecologically astonishing. By the time the Endangered Species Act was passed in 1973, and grizzly bears in the lower 48 states were listed as a threatened species under its protection, the population had been reduced to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 individuals scattered across a handful of isolated refugia. The Greater Yellowstone ecosystem in northwestern Wyoming, southwestern Montana, and eastern Idaho held the largest and most studied of these populations. The Northern Continental Divide ecosystem in northwestern Montana, centered on Glacier National Park, held another. Smaller, more tenuous populations persisted in the Cabinet Yaak and Selkirk ecosystems in Idaho and western Montana. The bear had been compressed from a continental range into a handful of mountain refuges. Separated from each other by hundreds of miles of terrain, they had been extirpated from decades or generations earlier. The recovery story that followed the 1973 listing is, by the standards of large carnivore conservation, genuinely remarkable. The Greater Yellowstone grizzly population, estimated at approximately 136 individuals in 1975, when formal monitoring began, has grown to somewhere between 700 and 1,000 animals today. The Northern Continental Divide population has grown as well, and now likely exceeds 1,000 individuals. The recovery has been documented in the scientific literature exhaustively, debated in management circles continuously, and celebrated in conservation communications regularly. The standard narrative of grizzly recovery emphasizes the population numbers, the core ecosystem health metrics, and the degree to which the species has pulled back from the brink of extirpation in the contiguous United States. That narrative is accurate as far as it goes. The question is whether it goes far enough to capture what is actually happening on the ground right now, and the evidence accumulating across the northern Rockies and beyond suggests it does not. The first thing the standard recovery narrative tends to underemphasize is what happens when a large carnivore population grows within a bounded landscape. Grizzly bears require substantial individual home ranges. Adult males in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem have been documented using ranges of between 800 and 1,500 square miles. Adult females use smaller ranges, but still substantial ones. As the population has grown, as the core ecosystems have approached, and in some analyses exceeded their biological carrying capacity for grizzly bears, something has to give. The population cannot simply increase indefinitely within a fixed landscape. The ecology does not allow it. What happens instead is that young bears, primarily subadult males that have not yet established territories and that are being displaced by the competitive pressure of established adults, begin moving. They disperse. They walk. They cover ground at a rate and across distances that routinely astonish the researchers who track them. And they are moving in directions that the standard recovery framework, which was built around the concept of core ecosystems connected by discrete recovery zones, did not fully anticipate. The dispersal behavior of grizzly bears is documented well enough in the scientific literature to establish baselines. But those baselines were established in an era when the population was smaller, the core ecosystems were less densely occupied, and the competitive pressure pushing dispersal was accordingly lower. What researchers are now documenting is dispersal events of a scale and geographic reach that exceed the historical record for the recovered population. Individual bears are moving not tens of miles from the core ecosystems, but hundreds. They are showing up in terrain that is not mapped as recovery habitat, that is not formally managed as grizzly bear territory, and that has not had a resident grizzly population in living memory. They are crossing the kinds of landscape features, agricultural valleys, highways, small towns, irrigated flatlands, that wildlife management frameworks traditionally treat as dispersal barriers. And they are surviving the crossing, at least some of them, long enough to be documented hundreds of miles from the nearest confirmed population cluster. The geographic scope of what has been documented in the last decade is worth tracing carefully, because the geographic specifics are where the pattern becomes undeniable. In northwestern Montana, grizzly bears from the northern Continental Divide ecosystem have been documented moving east onto the Rocky Mountain front and beyond, into prairie terrain that represents a fundamental habitat-type transition. These are not mountains. They are the rolling grasslands and badlands of north-central Montana, where the last grizzly bear was killed in the early decades of the 20th century, and where no management framework currently anticipates their presence. The bears documented there are not lost. GPS collar data from some individuals shows deliberate, directed movement across that terrain. Not the erratic wandering of a confused animal, but the purposeful travel of an animal exploring and, in some cases, returning to terrain it has found worth exploring. In 2019, a female grizzly with cubs was documented on the Rocky Mountain front more than 75 miles east of the park boundary. Females with cubs are not dispersing subadults driven by competitive pressure. They are established adult animals with home ranges. Finding 175 miles onto the prairie represents something different from a dispersing young male passing through. In Wyoming, the picture is similar, and in some respects more striking. Grizzly bears from the greater Yellowstone population have been documented moving south into the Wyoming Range, west of the Wind River Mountains, into terrain that is formally outside the designated recovery zone and that has not had a confirmed resident grizzly population since the 19th century. They have been documented moving north toward the Beartooth Plateau and beyond, in the direction of terrain that would, if bears continued moving, eventually connect the Yellowstone population with the northern Continental Divide population to the north. Whether that connectivity is happening is one of the most consequential and least publicly discussed questions in large carnivore conservation in North America right now. The official position of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has been that the two populations are not yet connected. The GPS data, the camera trap records, and the genetic analyses that are beginning to appear in peer-reviewed literature are starting to complicate that official position in ways that will matter enormously for how the species is managed going forward. The genetic evidence deserves particular attention because it provides information that behavioral observation and camera trap records cannot. Individual bears moving through landscapes leave physical traces that are not always captured by remote cameras or witnessed by humans. But they leave DNA. Hair snares, which are simple barbed wire enclosures with a scent lure that collect hair from bears that investigate them, have been deployed across large swaths of bear habitat in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming as part of monitoring programs that have been running for years in some cases. The genetic analysis of those hair samples does more than count bears. It identifies individuals, assigns them to family lineages, and in some cases reveals parentage relationships that bridge geographic distances. When a genetic analysis of hair samples from a bear documented in a location outside the mapped recovery zones reveals that it is the offspring of a known individual from the greater Yellowstone core, it establishes not just that the bear is there, but where it came from and how far it traveled. The distance from parent to offspring in some of these analyses is not the 20 or 30 miles that young male bears historically dispersed within the recovery zones. It is 150 miles. It is 250 miles. It is distances that the established behavioral framework for grizzly dispersal did not predict and cannot cleanly explain without revising the underlying model of how far individual bears can and will travel when competitive pressure is high and landscape permeability permits. The landscape permeability question is one that researchers have been examining with increasing urgency as the dispersal observations have accumulated. The traditional view was that grizzly bears are habitat specialists that require contiguous blocks of wild terrain and cannot successfully navigate the fragmented, human-dominated landscapes that separate the core recovery ecosystems. This view was not unreasonable, given the evidence available when the recovery framework was designed. It was also, the accumulating data suggests, somewhat overstated. Grizzly bears are demonstrably more capable of moving through human-dominated terrain than the traditional view held. They cross highways, they move through agricultural land, grazing allotments, and timbered areas under active management. They navigate small towns and ranch complexes at night. They are adaptable in ways that the species' reputation as a wilderness specialist does not fully capture. The animals showing up hundreds of miles outside their expected range are not doing so by finding corridors of pristine wilderness that nobody knew existed. They are, in many documented cases, moving through terrain that wildlife managers would have classified as impassable barriers a generation ago, and doing so successfully enough to arrive hundreds of miles away and, in some cases, establish themselves in that new terrain long enough to be detected multiple times. The terrain they are arriving in is the part of this story that carries the most significant implications and the most unresolved questions. When a grizzly bear shows up in the Black Hills of South Dakota, which has happened, the terrain it arrives in is not uninhabited wilderness. It is a region with a significant human population, substantial agricultural activity, livestock operations, and a set of land management frameworks built around a wildlife community that has not included a grizzly bear in well over a century. The communities in that region have no institutional memory of coexisting with the species. The ranchers, the hunters, the recreationists, the rural homeowners, the agency personnel have no trained protocols for managing encounters with an animal that is simultaneously one of the most dangerous large mammals in North America and a federally threatened species with all the legal protection that designation entails. The arrival of a grizzly bear in that context is not simply a biological event. It is a social, legal, and management event of considerable complexity that the existing institutional frameworks are not well equipped to handle. The livestock conflict dimension of this picture is where the outside range occurrence of grizzly bears becomes most immediately consequential for the human communities involved. Grizzly bears are significant predators of livestock, where their ranges overlap with ranching operations. Within the established recovery zones, the mechanisms for managing that conflict have been developed over decades. The federal government's livestock compensation programs pay ranchers for documented losses to grizzly predation. Non-lethal deterrent protocols, electric fencing, range riders, livestock guardian dogs have been refined through years of trial and error and now represent a reasonably mature toolkit. State and federal agencies have staff with specific expertise in managing the grizzly livestock interface. The conflict exists, it is contentious, but there is at least an institutional architecture for addressing it. None of that architecture exists in the areas where these outside-range grizzlies are being documented. A rancher in central Montana whose cattle are killed by a bear that the available evidence suggests is a dispersing grizzly from Yellowstone finds himself in a legal and institutional landscape that was not designed for his situation. The compensation mechanisms that apply inside the recovery zone may not apply the same way outside it. The agency expertise is concentrated in the core areas. The protocols that have been developed through decades of adaptive management are not automatically transferred to new terrain where the relevant staff may have never managed a grizzly bear encounter at all. The rancher is dealing with an apex predator he has no protocol for, potentially with an animal whose federal protection status makes independent management responses legally complicated. In a region whose state wildlife agency may have no dedicated grizzly bear management program because until recently there was nothing to manage. The encounters between grizzly bears and humans in these outside range areas carry risks that deserve honest quantification. Grizzly bears are responsible for more human fatalities in North America than any other large carnivore over the relevant time period, though the absolute numbers are still small in the context of the other ways humans die. The dynamics of grizzly bear attacks on humans are well studied within the core recovery areas and fall into recognizable categories. Surprise encounters at close range, in which a bear responds defensively to a perceived threat, account for a significant proportion of attack incidents. Predatory attacks, in which a bear has identified a human as prey and pursues that assessment deliberately, are rarer but occur and are most commonly associated with specific behavioral signatures in the bear involved. Both categories of encounter become more likely when humans and grizzly bears occupy the same landscape at elevated density without the established protocols and behavioral norms that develop over time in communities that have long coexisted with the species. In the core recovery areas, generations of residents, hunters, hikers, and agency personnel have developed a practical working knowledge of how to behave in grizzly country. Carrying bear spray is standard. Traveling in groups, making noise on trails, handling food and attractants properly, understanding the difference between a defensive charge and a predatory approach, knowing how to respond to each. This knowledge is transmitted through community norms, agency messaging, hunting culture, and simple lived experience in a way that accumulates over time and represents a real and meaningful reduction in encounter risk, even though it is not easily quantifiable. None of that accumulated practical knowledge exists in the communities where these outside-range grizzlies are arriving. A hiker in the Black Hills who has never thought about grizzly bears because grizzly bears were not there, does not own bear spray, does not know the encounter response protocols, and does not have the pattern recognition built from years of living in grizzly country that tells an experienced person when a bear in the middle distance is doing something worth taking seriously. The outside range occurrence of grizzly bears does not just create a biological management challenge. It creates a human safety knowledge deficit in the affected communities that will take time to address even if the institutional response is swift, which historically it has not been. The question of what is driving this pattern of outside range occurrence is the one that researchers are most actively debating and that has the least consensus answer. The population growth explanation, the idea that recovery has filled the core ecosystems to capacity and is now pushing surplus animals outward, is the most commonly offered and has genuine mechanistic support. The core ecosystems do appear to be at or near their biological carrying capacity for grizzly bears. The competitive pressure on young dispersing males is real and documented. The correlation between population growth in the cores and increasing outside range detection does hold up to basic scrutiny. But population pressure alone does not explain everything that the data shows. It does not explain why some of the bears moving outside the established range are adult females, not dispersing subadults. It does not explain why the directions of movement sometimes seem to exceed what competitive pressure alone would predict. and it does not explain the specific terrain features that seem to be attracting bears in some of the outside range locations that have produced repeated detections rather than single pass-through events. The food resource explanation deserves serious consideration as a complement to the population pressure hypothesis, and in some of the documented cases, it may be the more important driver. Grizzly bears are famously omnivorous and ecologically flexible in their food habits. Their diet shifts dramatically by season, region, and individual circumstance. Within the core recovery areas, the specific food resources that grizzly bears depend on for the hyperphagia period in late summer and fall, when they must accumulate the fat reserves that will sustain them through denning, have been changing. Whitebark pine nuts, which have historically been a critical hyperphagia food for greater Yellowstone grizzlies at high elevation, have been catastrophically reduced by white pine blister rust and mountain pine beetle infestations that are themselves connected to changing climate patterns. Cutthroat trout, another historically important food source in the Yellowstone system, have been significantly reduced by the introduction of lake trout, which prey on cutthroat in the deep water zones where human intervention cannot easily reach them. Army cutworm moths, which grizzly bears access at high-elevation talus fields and which represent an extraordinary concentrated caloric resource during the hyperphagia period, are variable and not guaranteed annually. The degradation of these core hyperphagia food sources has been documented and discussed in the scientific literature in the context of grizzly bear nutrition and reproductive success within the recovery areas. Its potential role in driving bears to explore terrain outside the mapped range in search of alternative food resources has received less systematic attention but is logically compelling. A grizzly bear that is not meeting its caloric requirements within its established home range will extend that range. If the terrain adjacent to its historical home range offers food resources that the core area no longer provides at historical rates, the behavioral response of moving toward those resources is not merely possible. It is predicted by everything we know about grizzly bear foraging ecology. And some of the outside range locations where bears have been repeatedly detected have food resources that are relevant to this calculation. Agricultural grain fields, orchards, beehives, livestock carcasses, agricultural waste streams that represent, to a grizzly bear's opportunistic foraging strategy, an extraordinary caloric opportunity. The bears finding these resources and returning to them are not behaving irrationally or inexplicably. They are behaving exactly as their foraging ecology predicts. They are just doing it in places the management framework did not anticipate. The climate dimension of this picture is one that requires careful handling because the temptation to attribute everything to climate change is as analytically problematic as the temptation to attribute nothing to it. But, in the specific context of grizzly bear range dynamics, the climate signal is present in ways that go beyond correlation. The range shifts of the prey and food species that grizzly bears depend on are themselves responses to changing temperature and precipitation patterns that are documented and measurable. Elk herds in some parts of the northern Rockies are shifting their seasonal distribution patterns in response to changing snow conditions and vegetation phenology. The berry crops that constitute a major hyperphagia food source across the species range are exhibiting increased variability in production that appears connected to spring precipitation and temperature patterns. The high-elevation meadows where army cutworm moths concentrate are accessible for shorter periods in some years and longer in others as snowpack timing changes. The net effect of these shifts on a grizzly bear population is not a simple directional push in any one geographic direction. It is an increase in year-to-year uncertainty about where the best food resources will be found, which in turn may be increasing the exploratory ranging behavior that produces outside range detections. The river systems and riparian corridors that appear in a disproportionate share of the outside range documentation deserve specific attention because they represent the clearest structural explanation for how bears are moving where they are moving. Rivers are grizzly bear highways in a literal ecological sense. They provide food, cover, water, and navigation cues along linear corridors that can extend for hundreds of miles through terrain that would otherwise present significant movement barriers. The Columbia River System, the Missouri River System, the Snake River, and its tributaries. These are not just geographic features. They are connectivity infrastructure for large mammals moving through the landscape. When you plot the confirmed outside range grizzly bear detections over the past decade against the river systems of the northern Rocky Mountain region, the correlation is not subtle. Bears are not appearing randomly across the landscape. They are appearing along waterways and in the drainages that connect waterways, following the paths of least resistance and greatest food availability through terrain that would be much more difficult to traverse cross-country. This observation has significant implications for predicting where grizzly bears will appear next in outside-range locations, and those predictions are not reassuring from the perspective of communities that have not begun preparing. The river systems of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming extend into states that have not been part of any grizzly bear recovery discussion. The Yellowstone River, flowing northeast out of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, passes through central Montana and ultimately reaches eastern Montana and the Dakotas. The Missouri River connects to drainage systems that historically supported grizzly bears across the Great Plains before the 19th century extirpation. If bears are following these waterways, which the evidence strongly suggests some of them are, the geographic range of potential outside range occurrences is not bounded by the margins of the mountain west. It extends, theoretically and in some cases practically, much further east than the current documented record reaches. The institutional response to the outside range occurrence pattern has been slow, fragmented, and uncoordinated in ways that reflect the genuine difficulty of managing a federally threatened species that does not respect the jurisdictional boundaries of the agency frameworks built to manage it. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which carries primary federal responsibility for grizzly bear recovery under the Endangered Species Act, has a management framework organized around the 6 recovery zones identified in the 1993 Recovery Plan. Bears that appear outside those zones are not automatically outside the species' legal protection, since the ESA listing applies to the species not just to specific geographic areas, but they exist in an institutional gray zone where the management protocols, the compensation mechanisms, the monitoring infrastructure, and the institutional expertise are absent or attenuated. State wildlife agencies, in the states where outside range bears are being documented, have widely varying degrees of preparation. Montana, which has the most experience with grizzly bears of any state other than Alaska, has staff and protocols that can be applied, imperfectly, to outside range incidents. Wyoming is similar. Idaho has a more complicated relationship with the species given the intense conflict between grizzly bear recovery interests and livestock and hunting interests in parts of the state. States further east that have no history of managing grizzly bears within the living institutional memory of their agencies are effectively starting from zero when an outside range bear appears on a trail camera or kills a calf on a ranch in their territory. The legal complexity compounds the institutional challenge. When a grizzly bear outside the designated recovery zone kills livestock, the rancher's legal options are constrained in ways they are not with unlisted species. The circumstances under which a grizzly bear can be legally killed in defense of life or property are specifically defined under the ESA and the implementing regulations, and the definition is not always straightforward in outside-range contexts. The compensation programs that exist within the core recovery areas are federally and state-funded and are built on a bureaucratic infrastructure that was designed for those specific geographies. Extending that infrastructure to new areas requires administrative action that moves at a pace that does not match the pace at which bears are appearing in new locations. The gap between the speed of biological change and the speed of institutional adaptation is not a new problem in wildlife management. In the context of grizzly bears appearing in communities that have no preparation for them, it is a particularly consequential one. The ranching community's response to outside-range grizzly bear appearances has been predictably varied but with consistent themes. Where bears are detected, the response is frequently a combination of alarm, requests for clarification of legal status and response options, and demands for the kind of institutional support that does not exist in the relevant geography. The historical and ongoing conflict between grizzly bear recovery advocates and livestock interests within the core recovery zones has produced a political climate in which the ranching community's concerns about outside-range bears are sometimes dismissed as motivated opposition to recovery, rather than engaged as legitimate, practical challenges. This is a mistake both analytically and politically. The ranching community in areas where outside-range grizzlies are appearing has real and immediate interests at stake that deserve engagement rather than dismissal if the long-term goal of grizzly bear conservation across a meaningful portion of the species' historical range is to be achievable. The hunting community's relationship to the outside-range occurrence question is layered in ways that deserve unpacking. Within the core recovery zones, hunting interests have been among the most consistent and, in some cases, most intense opponents of grizzly bear population expansion, driven by documented impacts on elk and other game species that hunters value, and by safety concerns about hunting in terrain with elevated grizzly bear density. Outside the recovery zones, the perspective is sometimes different. Some hunters in areas where outside-range bears are appearing have expressed interest in the possibility that if the population expands and stabilizes in new terrain, a regulated hunting season might eventually be established, as has been advocated for the Yellowstone population. This prospect is deeply controversial within the conservation community, but represents a genuine and not unreasonable policy position within the hunting community's framework of wildlife management through regulated harvest. The political economy of grizzly bear management in new terrain is going to be shaped by these competing interests in ways that the purely biological analysis of range expansion does not capture. The indigenous dimension of this story is one that the standard wildlife management narrative has consistently underweighted and that deserves prominent consideration here. Grizzly bears occupy a significant cultural and spiritual place in the traditions of numerous tribal nations, whose historical territories encompass the core recovery areas and much of the terrain where outside-range occurrences are being documented. The relationship between tribal nations and grizzly bears predates the European contact by millennia and carries legal, cultural, and ecological weight that the contemporary management framework has not always adequately incorporated. Several tribal nations with reserved rights in grizzly bear habitat have treaty-based claims to participation in wildlife management decisions affecting the species that have been imperfectly honored in the management of the recovery program to date. As the bears move into terrain that encompasses additional tribal territories, the political and legal landscape of management authority becomes more complex and, in some cases, more contentious. The outside-range occurrence of grizzly bears in areas with significant tribal landholdings raises management questions that go well beyond the biological, and that the existing institutional frameworks are poorly equipped to resolve. The scientific community's internal debate about what the outside-range occurrence pattern means is substantive and not fully resolved, which is worth stating clearly because the outside view of scientific consensus on grizzly bear range dynamics sometimes implies more agreement than actually exists. There are researchers who view the current dispersal observations as a natural and expected consequence of successful recovery, consistent with theoretical predictions about large carnivore population dynamics, and who argue that the management framework simply needs to be updated to accommodate what is an ecologically positive development. There are other researchers who are more cautious about interpreting the outside range occurrences as evidence of genuine range expansion, rather than temporary excursions by individuals who will not establish themselves in the new terrain. The distinction matters enormously for management purposes. A dispersing subadult that moves through South Dakota and continues moving or dies without reproducing is an interesting data point, but not a management emergency. A reproducing population establishing itself in terrain outside the current management framework is a categorically different challenge, requiring a categorically different institutional response. The reproductive status of outside range individuals, when it can be determined, is therefore one of the most consequential data points in each documented case. A lone subadult male moving through an area is biologically significant in a limited way. A female with cubs detected outside the range is evidence of successful reproduction in or near terrain where the management infrastructure does not exist. A female detected outside the range who was not collared at the time of detection and whose origin can only be inferred from genetic analysis is a different kind of signal, one that suggests bears may be arriving in new terrain from distances and by routes that the current monitoring program is not fully capturing. The gaps in the monitoring infrastructure outside the core recovery areas are substantial. The camera traps are not systematic. The hare snare programs do not cover the terrain where outside range bears are most likely to appear. The collaring programs that produce the GPS data used to track individual movements are entirely concentrated in the core ecosystems. This means that what is being documented in outside range areas is almost certainly a significant undercount of the actual pattern. The bears that are appearing on cameras are the ones that happen to be in front of cameras. The monitoring infrastructure is not designed to detect them. If the monitoring infrastructure were extended into the terrain where outside range detections are occurring, the picture of how many bears are moving through that terrain and how far they are getting would almost certainly be more striking than the current documented record suggests. The public communication challenge associated with this situation is one that wildlife agencies are navigating with varying degrees of success and transparency. The messaging tension is real. Acknowledging that grizzly bears are appearing in unexpected locations activates anxieties in the affected communities that can produce political pressure for management responses that conflict with the species' federal protection. It can produce livestock management behaviors that are counterproductive to coexistence. It can produce lethal take of bears by landowners responding to perceived threats in situations where the legal framework does not clearly authorize such responses. All of these are legitimate concerns from the agency perspective, and they contribute to a communication approach that tends toward minimizing the significance of outside range occurrences and emphasizing their individual, anomalous character, rather than their aggregate pattern character. The cost of that communication approach is that the communities who most need to prepare for the presence of grizzly bears are the communities who are receiving the least timely and specific information about what is coming toward them. This is not a sustainable communication strategy for a long-term management challenge of this scope, and the gap between what agency personnel know and what they are publicly communicating will eventually produce a credibility cost that complicates future management work. The situation in the state of Washington provides a useful case study of how the management of outside-range grizzly bears can go poorly when the institutional preparation is inadequate and the communication is muddled. Washington state has a small confirmed grizzly bear population in the North Cascades ecosystem in the northern part of the state, estimated at fewer than 20 individuals and possibly as few as 5 to 10, which represents one of the most endangered large mammal populations in the contiguous United States. There have been repeated documented detections of grizzly bears in the South and Central Cascades, an area that is not currently managed as grizzly bear habitat, and where the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife has no dedicated grizzly bear management infrastructure. The response to those detections has been inconsistent. The public communication has been reactive rather than proactive, and the result has been a community and political environment in which the possibility of grizzly bear range expansion into the Central Cascades has become deeply polarized along lines that are more political than biological. The failure to communicate clearly and proactively about what was being documented on cameras and in the field has not prevented the conversation about grizzly bears in the Central Cascades from happening. It has simply ensured that the conversation happens in a framework shaped by rumor, anxiety, and mistrust, rather than in a framework shaped by accurate information and genuine institutional engagement. The rewilding conversation that has been gaining momentum in conservation circles over the past decade has complicated the management of outside-range grizzly bear occurrences in ways that deserve acknowledgement. Rewilding advocates have proposed the intentional reintroduction of grizzly bears to portions of their historical range outside the current recovery areas. Most prominently, the North Cascades of Washington State, the Bitterroot Wilderness of Idaho and Montana, and in the most ambitious proposals, portions of the southern Rocky Mountains in Colorado and New Mexico. These proposals have biological merit in the sense that the terrain in question historically supported grizzly bears and in most cases retains ecological characteristics that could support a population today. They have been and continue to be extraordinarily contentious because they propose to bring grizzly bears into landscapes where the human communities did not ask for them, where the livestock conflicts would be real and not trivial, and where the political conditions for coexistence management are not assured. The North Cascades reintroduction proposal has been in various stages of planning and environmental review for more than 2 decades and has been repeatedly delayed and modified in response to political opposition that is not simply irrational fear, but also the legitimate expression of communities that see an animal with significant management implications being proposed for their landscape without adequate preparation or institutional support. What the natural outside range occurrence observations do to this rewilding conversation is complicated. On one hand, the documentation of grizzly bears moving into landscapes outside their current range under their own power supports the argument that the terrain is suitable and that the species, given sufficient time and population pressure, will occupy it naturally. On the other hand, the management challenges, legal complexities, and community preparedness deficits that are being revealed by the natural outside range occurrences are a preview of the challenges that would accompany intentional reintroduction at a larger scale and at a faster pace. If the current outside range occurrence events are straining the institutional capacity of the affected state agencies and producing management outcomes that are inconsistent and sometimes inadequate, the intentional introduction of grizzly bears into entirely new ecosystems would strain those capacities far beyond what the natural dispersal process is currently demanding. The long-term trajectory of this situation depends on decisions being made right now across a landscape of competing interests and institutional actors that do not share a framework for making them coherently. The critical decisions involve monitoring infrastructure, specifically whether the federal and state agencies responsible for grizzly bear management will extend systematic monitoring programs into the terrain where outside range occurrences are being documented, which would allow the pattern to be characterized accurately rather than inferred from incomplete data. They involve compensation and conflict management infrastructure, specifically whether the mechanisms that have been developed within the core recovery zones can be extended to communities encountering bears for the first time without the institutional preparation that the core areas have accumulated over decades. They involve the legal and regulatory framework for managing grizzly bears outside the designated recovery zones, which is currently ambiguous in ways that create real-world problems for ranchers, agency personnel, and the bears themselves. And they involve public communication, specifically whether wildlife agencies will be transparent about the pattern they are observing and its implications, or whether they will continue to characterize each outside range occurrence as an individual anomaly in a way that is technically defensible but substantively misleading. The bears themselves are not waiting for these decisions to be made. They are moving now. A subadult male that dispersed from the northern continental divide ecosystem in late summer does not pause in its movement, while federal agencies complete environmental reviews, or while state legislatures appropriate funding for conflict compensation programs. It follows the drainage east. It finds the grain field. It finds the cattle that did not return from the summer range. It is detected on a camera by a rancher who has never managed a grizzly bear situation and does not know what legal options apply. It moves on, or it does not. It lives, or it does not. Either way, the next one is already moving. The historical record of large carnivore range dynamics in North America is not uniformly cautionary. The recovery of gray wolves in the northern Rockies, following their reintroduction to Yellowstone in 1995 and 1996, produced a pattern of range expansion, conflict, controversy, and eventual management accommodation that is instructive, though not perfectly analogous to the grizzly situation. Wolves dispersed from the reintroduction area faster and further than most predictions anticipated. They established populations in terrain that the management framework had not designated for them. They produced livestock conflicts in those areas before the conflict management infrastructure could be put in place. The result was a prolonged period of institutional scrambling and political conflict that generated more heat than light and that delayed the development of effective management responses in new terrain. The lessons of the wolf recovery, particularly the importance of proactive community engagement, rapid extension of conflict support mechanisms into new areas, and transparent communication about the trajectory of range expansion are directly applicable to the grizzly bear outside range situation and are not, based on current agency behavior, being consistently applied. The wolves also demonstrated that communities can adapt to large carnivore presence faster than the pre-adaptation pessimists predicted, and that the economic and ecological disruptions, while real, were less catastrophic than the most alarmed voices anticipated. The grizzly bear is a larger, more dangerous, and more ecologically impactful animal than the wolf in most management contexts, and the analogy is therefore imperfect. But the basic point that communities and institutions adapt to wildlife realities when given adequate support, information, and institutional resources holds across the wolf case and is relevant to the grizzly bear situation. The question is not whether the communities where outside-range grizzlies are appearing can eventually develop workable coexistence frameworks. The evidence from the core recovery areas suggests that they can. The question is whether the institutional support, the honest communication, and the resources needed to make that adaptation possible will be provided in a time frame and at a scale that makes the adaptation achievable without unacceptable costs to the people involved, and without the political backlash that could undermine the species' broader recovery trajectory. The 48 states that make up the contiguous United States represent a landscape in which a species that once numbered in the tens of thousands has been reduced to a few thousand, recovered partially, and is now, for the first time in a century, moving outward into terrain that its management